Now we're going to hear from Nicole Stephensen on when that co-design or cooperation doesn't happen, what's the result? So over to you, Nicole. Thank you.
Katina, thank you so much for having me here today. This is an exceptional event. I'm having the best time sitting back having like my third cup of coffee because it's still pretty early here in Brisbane. But I'm delighted to be involved and to be able to speak to everyone today about privacy is my particular area of expertise, but in the context of public interest technologies, it's actually so exciting and a breath of fresh air to talk in a forum like this, because normally I'm talking about things like compliance, right, and managing obligations that are set out in law from an organizational or government perspective. So I'm just going to share my screen with you all now, and please do let me know when you are able to see that, Katina.
I can see that, and it's in the right view.
Wonderful, thank you. So as I was saying, I often talk about privacy in the context of compliance, right? How do we manage personal information in accordance with the law? And that seems to be the way that privacy tends to be understood, particularly in terms of industry or government. And I often say to people when I'm defining privacy, now wait a minute, it's not just about protecting personal information in accordance with the law. It's also about observing what we understand to be community expectations in relation to what happens to their personal information. And those expectations they're founded in our civil liberties, right? Our right to be let alone and our right to be free from intrusion into our private lives. And it's really important to keep this in mind as we're thinking about technology, because the worry I have is that we are globally on the wrong trajectory. That's why I most appreciate being here today, because, hopefully I have some insight to lend to the discussion. Now, I want to talk about where we are. We are smack bang in the middle of the fourth industrial revolution, right? We have connections and interconnections in our society like we have never seen before, not just socially, but between governments, connections economically. These are really interesting, challenging, exciting, scary times, all kind of wrapped into one. And data, including the personal information of you and of me, is a staple across this new interconnected society that we're living in now. Socially, economically, politically, everyone's concerned about the data, right? What data can we get? How much data can we get? How do we add the data to the data? It just goes on and on and on. It's almost like this self-perpetuating machine at this point, which I find, again, interesting, but also scary. Technology here is outpacing our regulation. And this has given rise to some uncomfortable realities from a privacy perspective. First, the giants rule. And that creates a privacy paradox, right? The more that we connect and interconnect, the more we feel that we need what the giants are offering. The more we feel the need to connect on social media, to do our shopping online, to use that new smartphone, to download apps for our children's education that are suggested by their school. It creates a privacy paradox, right? Where on one hand, we understand our need to be free from intrusion, but we really want the thing. We really want to be engaged in the thing. So often we bypass what we understand to be our feelings or our needs in relation to privacy in order to achieve that objective that the giants are offering to us. It's also given rise to surveillance capitalism. And I know I don't have time to go into these really heavy topics today, but suffice to say that surveillance capitalism is the notion that in observing a community, in observing people, in observing you and me, there's an opportunity to make money. And let me assure you, the people making the money are not you and me. It's not those that the data is about that are making money. It's the people who are gathering that data and then supplying it out to others. There's also the concept of ubervalence, which I'm sure some of you listening today are aware of in terms of the relatively new noun that it is. This is the idea that observation of the community of people is growing. right? The opportunities to watch us, to track us, to trace us. It's not just something that's happening from around us or above us. It's now happening on us in terms of wearables and other devices, and also in us, you know, for example, say pacemakers or some other kind of implant. But it's not just that, it's the idea that by surveilling from all different vantage points, including from within a person, there is an opportunity to have so much more control over that individual and the way that they operate in society. Also within the fourth industrial revolution, we have an increasing landscape of privacy threats and harms. And when I was talking before about what privacy is and the fact that it's not just about protecting personal information in accordance with the law, then this gives rise to the question of, well, how do we understand what our privacy harms are? And actually, how deep within the community do they go? You know, an example would be in terms of surveillance. Surveillance is a privacy threat. But the harm associated with surveillance is that there may be a degree of decisional interference in terms of what I do in my life. If I know I'm going to be watched while I'm walking down the Queen Street Mall, maybe I'm going to take another route. Maybe I'm going to miss going into my favorite coffee shop because I don't want someone, whoever that someone is, to know that I've gone in to have a coffee on that morning. Now, the fourth industrial revolution, for all that's good and bad about it, has led to a degree of techlash, and we're all familiar with that term. Now, as a privacy professional, I can tell you that all of us within the profession took this collective breath out when we started to see within sort of mainstream media infographics like the one you see on the screen today, which is has been put out by Visual Capitalist. And the infographic shows just how much personal information can be known about a person, even though the person might not be, you know, knowable in terms of, you know, their identity itself being known, but everything else about them may be easy to know and therefore easy to target an individual with or target a community with. Now that's really scary, the idea that there are companies out there that have such a degree of personal information about us. And, you know, as communities, we're only just becoming alive to this. Now, there is that greater degree of awareness in terms of how our public and those private organizations are collecting and handling and dealing in our personal information. And this has created a trust problem. And we only have to look to the Facebook and Cambridge Analytica scandal of recent days to know what happens when people realize that they've been duped or when they feel that something dishonest has happened in terms of their personal information. So what we have now is a growing community distrust of our technologies and the purveyors of them, especially where those technologies are deployed by governments. We have an aliveness within the community to this notion that nothing's free. You know, it's that whole adage that if something's free, well, it's not the product you are. There's also a degree of suspicion and fear and conjecture within the community, starting to become aware of the fact that there's a trade-off greater than may seem when one reads the terms and conditions before logging on to a particular platform or when one enters into a contract for some other kinds of goods or services. What's great, though, is that this has led then to this wonderful, almost relief-giving philosophical pause where we're talking now as governments, as academics, as you know, professionals in this space about public interest technologies. And the fact that the technologies themselves may be public interest technologies, but there's such a public interest in having these technologies from a privacy perspective. The technologies bring with them the premise that tech can address social needs and challenges in our society. And I see that this has great potential for richness in our innovation, right? I mean, we've just heard some great discussions this morning or this afternoon where you are about the richness in innovation that comes with focusing on the public interest, focusing on the community we serve. And I think this brings with it too these sort of new imperatives for our public policy makers and new imperatives for how we make our decisions. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. The opportunity to design for better community outcomes, though, also requires us to limit those issues such as privacy encroachment. And because of this, I see that there's going to be a really big leap for today's data giants, those that are already involved in the purveying and gobbling of our personal information. They may take a little while to get on the public interest technology bandwagon. And in some ways, I feel like we may, as a society, be in a place where there are the data brokers or the data giants on one hand, and then there are those concerned with the public interest on the other. And I hope that that's not the case. I don't appreciate that kind of fragmentation in the world that we're trying to develop for ourselves. So if we're going to develop public interest technologies then, or try to change the technologies that already exist, we do have to find a way to get there safely. And certainly in my role, privacy is so much about making decisions in a way, using a framework to make decisions in a way that allows us to achieve our objectives safely from the perspective of the community and the information about them that we have. And I think it's really important here to remember that principle-based decision-making, particularly when it comes to privacy, is not just about compliance. It's about so much more than that. We have to always think about decisions that affect people, right? Where, for example, our decisions might increase their visibility while they're conducting their private lives. We have to always think about that privacy lens. Now, what's interesting is that our privacy laws worldwide at the moment are concerned with the identifiability of a person. So most privacy laws in some way define personal information or personal data as being linked to an identifiable individual or someone that's reasonably able to be identified through the data or the information at hand. And I see this as being a gap, right? The narrative and regulation here ought to include the concept of individuation. If we think back for a moment to that infographic that I showed you, that showed the vast amounts of data about a person that's being gathered by our data giants, most of that is not identifiable in and of itself. But when it's combined, can form a pretty good digital twin or picture of an individual without actually naming, oh, that individual's Nicole Stephensen, let's market to her, or that's Nicole Stephensen, we need to go and find where she is. There are real opportunities to target and track and trace and interact with people without actually knowing them. Now, there's some great analysis on this by my colleague, Anna Johnson. And Anna is another privacy professional here in Australia, and she's written a tremendous paper on individuation and the fact that the privacy laws we have worldwide right now, regulation as it stands, is not fit for purpose in this current fourth industrial revolution that we're living in. Okay, but where do we start, right? So I've just said, okay, we have a problem with our laws. Well, what do we do in the meantime? Well, there are privacy principles that have been in existence for quite some time that do give us that framework or that scaffolding that will assist us to make good decisions. But in addition to that, what we have had are our privacy regulators worldwide getting together and saying, look, at the time that we're in, we need to think about privacy and arrive at our decisions just a little bit differently. And recently, when I was looking at the topic of surveillance particularly, and it was in relation to tracking and tracing technologies associated with responding to the COVID-19 pandemic that we're in, I ended up coming across some great work by Canada's privacy regulator. And the work was predicated on the idea that, look, okay, we all understand we have privacy laws. We all understand that we have, trips and traps and hoops that we have to jump through in order to do the things that we want to do with personal information. But it's really important, particularly during times of crisis or other times where the community could be at a disadvantage in terms of power imbalance between the government and themselves, that we take decisions that are based on clear and actionable principles. And I've listed the principles here for you today because they come straight from the horse's mouth in terms of, okay, what should be done before we build our COVID-19 tracking apps? And some of the principles, I would say, most of the principles are highly transferable. And I think it's important to think about this when we're thinking about public interest technologies. If there are a set of principles out there that assist with good decision making, it doesn't matter if we've only used them in making decisions in a certain context. We can apply those principles to other contexts too, whether it's across sectors or across technologies. An example in terms of the, say, COVID-safe tracking technologies is the fact that we need to go through an exercise of determining, say, necessity and proportionality. So is the application or the technology necessary to fill the community purpose? And then is the amount of data that we're proposing to gather, is the amount of personal information we're going to use and keep and work with, is it proportionate to the need? So, you know, this does beg the question though, what about those guys? What about the data giants? Is it possible for them to make good decisions after the fact? Or are we just going to be able to make good decisions in terms of the public interest technologies that are being developed and that are evolving now? I would argue, you know, maybe it's a bit of a Pollyanna worldview about privacy, but there you have it. I would argue that where privacy hasn't been designed for at the outset, there is still an opportunity to bolt it on to a great degree after the fact. And that the kinds of privacy principles that I've just shown you, the ones that operate in addition to what we might find embedded in our laws and best practices worldwide, they still offer that valuable level of scaffolding going forward. So my parting thoughts for you today are this. Privacy is about making good decisions in the collection and dealing with personal information. And it's important not just to think about our compliance obligations, because, you know, these need to have an uplift, I would argue. Instead, let's think about the community that we serve and have that be our starting point. And as we move through the fourth and into the fifth industrial revolution, the pace of innovation and technology is dangerously close to getting beyond us. And we must make sure that doesn't happen. We must not be blind to the pace of things. In our innovations, let's please not just innovate in terms of technology, let's also innovate to address gaps in our regulation, our oversight models, and our privacy mindset generally as a society. And finally, I believe we have a collective responsibility to design for the world that we want to live in. And in doing so, this is a participatory thing. It's not a passive thing. But in participating, it implies that we all have a duty to act, to speak up, and challenge and demand better decision making from our technology providers and our decision makers. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nicole. May I just say, every time I have had the fortune in the last few months of listening to you, I walk away thinking how incredible and crisp a speaker you are and presenter you are. You're able to somehow break these huge, deep concepts to simple sort of consumable bites. And I don't know how you do it, but I want to start modeling how I present on your work.
Oh, wow. Thank you. I'm honored. That's such lovely feedback, Katina. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's going to be special about our PIC Colloquium series. We've got people who not only have the content in here, they know how to convey it, they know how to embrace others, and they know how to bring people along. Let's go to the floor with questions. Please feel free to unmute and ask Nicole. She's one of many wonderful Australian privacy consultants and security consultants. Anna Johnson, another that you mentioned, and so many of our broader network. But could we go to the floor and open for questions?
Sure, Nicole, I'll take a stab. This is Bob Cook-Deegan. I'm from ASU. I'm one of the colleagues of Katina. I'm struggling with a community that discovered after Cambridge Analytica that they have all sorts of personal sites on Facebook and through Twitter that are, you know, in our little community of people who are at inherited risk of cancer. That's their community defining feature. They discovered that they were swimming in the data pool with no lifeguards. And when they alerted the purveyors of those services that are providing an incredibly valuable service for them of finding each other, which is very hard to do otherwise, and creating a kind of an online community that is a community, they realized, oh my gosh, we're taking risks that they've actually kind of lied to us about, frankly. And now they're trying to come up with, well, how do we fix that? And they've come up with principles. What we haven't come up with is a sustainable model for actually doing the same function in a safe place that isn't Facebook or isn't one of these giants. So how do we do the same functions that the giants are conveying or that they're carrying out in a space that's actually sustainable and has an economic model and all that?
You know, that's such a good point, because what the likes of Facebook have done for society on one hand, in terms of encouraging us to connect, you know, in a particular way, right? Facebook has almost defined the way that we interact socially. And it's become also, you know, a political platform and you know, a community-based decision-making platform, and even you know, a product sales platform, right? It's really morphed in terms of its application, and everyone who got on board in terms of the social and community mindedness part now is so used to that method of communicating and socializing and getting together that it almost has become the default. And I see that as very dangerous, because Facebook wasn't built for that, you know, but we're using it for that. Now there are platforms that are being developed that I know of, and they may offer an alternative. The challenge is, though, is that people have they've come to this place where there's such a mistrust in relation to the likes of Facebook, that going on to something else that has the look and feel of Facebook is perhaps going to be self-defeating. It's almost like we need to remake the model with, you know, through which we communicate in relation to really important social issues, or even health issues. I like the idea that there might be a community of practice, or a community of sharing, or a community of learning that's associated with our health outcomes. My mom, actually, she had multiple myeloma, which is a type of blood cancer. It's cancer of the stem cells. And it was so relevant to her and provided her with such a richness of experience in such a horrible time, to have a community of people around her that understood what she was going through. But I think it would have been very upsetting for her and deeply concerning if that didn't feel like it was private or could be made to be private. So on your point about Facebook not being the right mechanism, I 100% agree. I feel like the co-design discussion that we've just had is a real opportunity here for building something of that nature that is that's issue specific and community need specific, right? And as I said, there's a doctor called Nick Puvia that I know, that I've provided some you know, sort of ad hoc privacy, collegial privacy advice to along the way, and he is of the same mind as you, that there should be a mechanism out there. And I don't know if it's about encouraging our app developers to co-design with the cancer survivor community, for example, or the community of people currently with cancer or other medical illnesses, but there's a real opportunity there. The thing I would say, though, is if we do it the way we've always done it in terms of platform design, where we're designing for the specifications of the platform as opposed to the needs of the individuals, I feel that it will probably come tumbling down. In many ways, I think we need to design for preference so much more than we're designing for requirements that might be set out in terms and conditions, for example.
Bob, what's your experience been on that more recently? I know we had a discussion on it last year, but what are you finding?
Well, so what we found in our groups is they've been struggling now for 2 years. We actually came up with a set of principles and rules, and we think we could get it to work, but all the funding streams are national level or they're connected to companies, and there's really nobody who's taking responsibility. It's because these things were free, and they turned out to be incredibly valuable organic things that people incorporated into their lives. but they depended on these moderators who are spending full time of their lives as communication nodes in an incredibly valuable network, but they aren't paid. And there's no sustainable model that doesn't rely on some output at the back end that's kind of secret and scurrilous that pays for the good stuff at the front end. And we haven't discovered any funding stream to pay for the governance or to allow us to buy access to a platform or anything like that. It's a work in progress, and it's actually quite frustrating because we thought we've got the technical chops to solve this problem. What we don't have is a funding stream and a stable infrastructure that would allow us to move people off of Facebook while keeping bridges to the Facebook, because that's where everybody's going to find each other in the first place forever now, or at least for the foreseeable future. So it's really frustrating. We don't have a solution.
And, you know, moving away from Facebook is so important because it takes away that shared privacy risk, right? The moment you post personal information of any kind on a platform like that, that platform has it, and they're managing that personal information in accordance with their own privacy policy. And what you find with those platforms, and I believe this about our tech giants, and it's so disappointing to me as a privacy professional, they are trying to redefine what privacy even means to us as a community and as a society. And they decide just how far they're going to apply that understanding of community expectations and lawful obligations, and they run with what works for them, not necessarily with what's lawful or with what sits well within the community that they ostensibly serve.
Yeah, there's just no way that this would be designed this way now. I mean, so just to give you an example, the model we're coming up with now is you need to keep that bridge to Facebook, because that's where the people, that's the largest agglomeration. That's where people are going to find each other. But before they start sharing pictures of their breasts and information about the mutations in their bodies, we want them off of Facebook. So we want to have a bridge that connects to Facebook, but we want the highly personal data to be offline. Not offline, online, available to their community, but not to the anybody who wants to buy access to it.
There's something, and I cannot remember the name of the company to save my life now. I'm so embarrassed, but it's a product called Solid Pods. And it's the idea where individuals, you know, are able to have a collation of information available electronically, digitally, you know, through whatever, you know, device or mechanism they wish, but that they have agency over that data, that it is theirs, as opposed to belonging to the data brokers or the purveyors simply by virtue of using their platform. So those kind of options, I think, are going to need to come to the fore, and maybe pushing the idea of data agency, individual data agency, to a greater extent in order to allow for those community outcomes.
Can I just say,
if you remember that company, flip me an email if you don't mind.
Oh, I will, absolutely.
at ASU.
we'll make sure to write that in the chat window for you, Nicole.
Thank you.
You know what I love? I love these discussions because they lead to solutions. They lead to startups. They lead to gaps, right? That haven't been filled. Nicole Stephensen, that was brilliant. Bob, thank you for the interaction as well.